Hello and welcome back to the Product Launch Podcast. As always, my name is Sean Boyce from NxtStep Product Strategy. My guest that I have with me here today is Ben Johnson from Freya Systems. Hello, Ben. How are you? And thank you for being on the show.
Hi, Sean. I'm great. And thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. So before we kind of jump into the main content of the show, can you, for our listeners, give us a little bit background information about yourself and also help us better understand what Freya Systems is?
Yeah, sure thing. So as you said, my name is Ben. I come from England originally. You can probably tell from my slightly odd accent. Originally, I qualified as an aerospace engineer, kind of fell into the software space. And I emigrated to America 15 years ago now. Just became a citizen this year, which is awesome. And thank you. And after being in the kind of big corporate space for a while, I decided it wasn't really for me. I could do some things more efficiently. So I founded Freya with my business partner, and we've been going for 10 years now. We really focus on software and data analytics products in the kind of enterprise, the big corporate enterprise space. So we make applications to fit in other people's enterprises. So it's very targeted at their users. All about taking data from aircraft, for example, and helping them visualize that, make decisions based off of it, and predict what failures are going to happen on the aircraft.
So I think what you're actually saying here is that you have a really cool job.
Yeah, I think it's a really cool job. Yeah, it's true.
I do too. I'm sure a lot of people would agree with you. And sticking with that topic of being really cool, I noticed your LinkedIn tagline, which is linked to your profile. I'll include in the show notes at the end as well too. But it says, I want to share this with everyone. It says, helping aviation, transportation, and manufacturing predict the future, which is, I love it. Short, sweet, super effective. Talk to us a little bit more about what that means.
So what that means for us is we can use customers' data. So we take real-time data that's being gathered on the aircraft, for example. I don't do this personally. I wish I could. I've got an awesome team of data scientists who will then dig into that. Usually they're presented with a really kind of complex question that they need to answer. So, we've got a particular component that's failing on the aircraft. How can we figure out how to make that more effective? Or in particular, how can we predict when that's going to fail? So that way they can either have a part on hand if they need it, or even better, they can do some maintenance that will prevent it failing in the first place. So it's all about allowing them to really extend the life of the aircraft, or at least its availability for use. And so we go from creating algorithms to help process the data and present the answer to that, all the way through to creating an internal web application that will allow them to present that information that comes from an algorithm in a way that they can make that decision in a repetitive sort of way across the whole fleet. So they can really identify specific aircraft that might fail, so they can maybe use another one for a particular mission that they want to conduct, or as I say, identify where they need to put parts and what maintenance they need to do.
Very cool. I know data and analytics, especially the predictive nature of that, is growing very aggressively. I think a lot of what I've heard, some of the more cooler things I've heard about the topic is that we already don't have enough processing power to process basically the data that we already have. Just giving you an idea of the size and scale of how much it is growing and how important it's going to be in order to be able to make heads and tails of it going forward. So it sounds like you guys are pretty well positioned to be able to help companies specifically with all the problems that come with using this data to predict really solving problems for them.
Yeah, that's true. And that's very insightful. The volumes of data that we have are certainly growing. Our experience is also that we can do some pretty impressive things with fairly minimal data sets as well. A lot of our team are doing kind of some fairly heavyweight statistics based off of the data that comes off. In some cases, they're really digging into the science associated with vibration levels, so there's harmonics involved, really kind of complex interactions between the various components. But we've also found that we can even solve some fairly simplistic problems with just a few spreadsheets worth of data. Now, we're always looking for those huger volumes, you know what I mean? And right now we're getting gigabytes worth of data per aircraft per flight. And you're right, it's growing in ever increasing levels, and they're putting more and more sensors on. And yeah, it's nice to be at the leading edge of that and really starting to understand what's the art of the possible, which is what I always like to say, and actually solving some very specific business needs, which I think is critical in anything. We don't just go fishing. We actually kind of identify what we're going to resolve.
Agreed. That's a really good point. I think it's sexy to talk about, what problems you solved with however much massive amount of data that you have. And I think there's a lot of focus on what are we going to do with this tremendous amount of data. But I think what may often get lost is that it's really about solving those critical needs, which you talked about in the end. And that's where I want to kind of go next. So I want to talk to you more about the problems that you guys in particular help your customers with solving. But I think important to note from what you've said so far is that you may not need a tremendous amount of data to really make a big impact. So what can you do relatively quickly? I think that's an important component to it as well too. But let's have you talk a little bit more about what these types of problems are, what categories they fall into. You've mentioned a couple of things already, specifically with what I guess for you would be like enterprise, aviation, and potentially optionally defense as well.
Okay. Yes, certainly. I can dig into that some. And as you say, there's a whole range of things that we can solve. Usually, with a smaller data set, it's quite usually a case of, well, what other data do we want to gather to answer the bigger question? Do you know what I mean? So that allows you to say, if we had sensors here and here, then I could tell you this, or I could predict, maybe rather than it being 2 days into the future, I can predict a month or 2 months into the future. Or in the case of aviation, it's all about flying hours. It's how much they use the particular aircraft. So allowing them to kind of understand what is the art of the possible. There's so much data that's coming off of the aircraft. The first question is usually, well, what can I solve with that? And then we help guide them to kind of what their specific questions are. So usually they're looking for something that there's a particular component, maybe that's not as reliable as they want it to be, so it's failing more frequently, or it's experiencing a particular type of wear, which means that they're going to need to replace it more frequently. So how can they either eliminate that or be much more proactive in predicting when it's going to happen, so that they can understand how to disposition, as I think I said earlier in the podcast, like disposition their assets. So we'll help them zone in very specifically on a specific business problem that they want to solve as a first step. Quite often that's then expanded out once we understand what the art of the possible is. We quite often use Python and Jupyter notebooks to present out reports. That's a good way of either saying, oh, well, we're done. We've identified the one-off question, which is also, I think, key as well. Too often there's an idea that you have to create an enormous product to answer a specific question. But in our experience, quite often we found, as soon as I've got to an answer for one particular case, I'm good. We can stop, and then we can focus our efforts and the efforts of the customer on something that's value added kind of down the stream, so to speak. And so in some cases, though, they will then want to kind of grow that down the line. So they'll take the output of that, turn it into an algorithm, embed that algorithm in their enterprise level application, and then put it in a kind of customized dashboard to really help their engineers see when those failures are going to happen, see when those things are going to occur, and kind of guide their thinking, and even guide the next level of kind of digging into their data set. So it's a repetitive sort of thing, and the way I like to think of it is we augment their engineers, we don't replace them. I think quite often there's a lot of automation thinking at the moment, which is about replacing people. I like to think of it as we take away the mundane tasks so they can focus on the stuff that they're really good at. Do you know what I mean? They're really kind of deep level engineering, which is what they want to focus on.
I like that last part that you mentioned with regard to automation as well too. I think there's, I don't know if fear is the right word, but a certain amount of like skepticism with regard to what the true intentions of taking advantage of what automation has to offer are, from the perspective of just kind of replacing people, replacing individuals in the workforce. The way I've been thinking about it, of course, I have an engineering background as well too, so I may be slightly biased, is really helping us automate any task that can be automated at that point, because there's always more problems, right? There's always bigger things that need solving, and the things that, at least so far, until we have like come upon some true, right, AI, not just the sexy marketing aspect of what everyone thinks is AI today, the creativity, like the creative problem solving, which right now, you know, it falls squarely for the most part in the category of needing people to really kind of solve those problems and build those processes like what you guys do. Another thing that you mentioned as well was, and I want the listeners to particularly focus on this as well also, is even though Ben and Freya Systems and the work that you guys do is very complicated, it's very specialized, and it is a very large market, right? Talking about giant industry in that aviation, you had mentioned going about connecting relatively like elegant, but as simple as possible solution to solving the problems. That's really important because that's a pattern that persists throughout the work that we do and the people that we help as well too, is we're never looking to kind of overcomplicate our solutions. We want them to be as simple and as elegant as possible. And I believe it's kind of a misconception that that's the right approach to take, and that has to be fully featured, has to be, you know, a big, heavy product with a lot of moving parts. So, but that more often than not makes things more challenging for those involved. So I wanted everybody just to note that Ben had shared that even for his industry, which is, you know, like we said, large, complicated, very detailed and specific, that's still kind of a strategy that you guys use.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a fantastic piece of insight as well. I'm glad that you've kind of recognized it from your experience too, that there's way too often and I've come across this in the past, we've come across what I would call a Frankenstein application. So it's, I need to do this as well. So rather than writing a specific new application just for that, a product that's designed to answer that business need, quite often it gets bolted onto something else and it grows and grows, and then it's brittle and it breaks easily and it's not easy to maintain. So yeah, helping people stay laser focused on what is the key business problem that needs to get solved for anything, and then being, as you say, very elegant about that solution, and then moving on to the next thing is great. And just to add to what you said as well, yeah, it sounds very complex, some of what we do, and I'll be honest, some of the mathematics is very challenging, but the core concept of solving business problems, even for large corporations, which is what I do, I think that's very engaging for lots of people in the product space, because it allows you to really dig in deep to one specific customer, because I don't have to do a whole bunch of market research to find my customers. I've got a pool and I can query them directly. They're invested, they're engaged in working tightly with us, which is exciting as well. Like, there aren't many people, I think, who get to work hand in hand with their customer on a daily basis and kind of go backwards and forwards and riff on an idea and really dig in deep as to where we can add some great value. And I think that allows us to then really specifically solve that business problem. But I think one of the things they love about us, and it would be true for others, is we as a small team that they engage with can stay like focused on their need. And quite often, I mean, everyone's got a split focus these days. So to be able to have one specific team just addressing their product need is definitely something that's engaging for some people at times.
The phrase that I've heard thrown around a bit that I have also reshared is niche to get rich. So that's right. It's marketing terminology, of course, but the message that they're trying to convey is, and this is what I want the listeners to focus on as well also, is that a lot of what you have just articulated really is a great example in that you don't have to build something for everyone in order to be really successful, in order to have a lot of really big, impactful problems that need solving. So, you've chosen a particular industry based on your expertise and passion and so on and so forth. And I'm sure there is never a limit to the amount of problems that need solving, right? And then you can build a great rapport with your customer, right, back and forth, and they will continue to build the trust in the relationship as that continues to evolve and bring more and more to you. And they're looking to you as the expert for the best strategic way to solve those problems. But that's one thing I kind of wanted to point out is another approach to kind of building products and building product businesses. The more specific that you get, it almost seems to have the opposite effect of what most people think it would do. Like a lot of people think if they get much more specific, their world's going to get a lot smaller. But in reality, what ends up happening is it has a tendency to grow, and people just seem to kind of come out of nowhere because they now know that you do specifically what they need, right? It's not, you're not going to, when you need something fixed from a surgery perspective, I have a problem with my knee, right? I don't go to a generalist. I go to a doctor that works specifically on knees. And then, everyone has knees. So eventually someone's going to have a problem there and they're going to go to that specialist, that expert to help solve them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think just to build on what you're saying now, I think one of the things that allows us to do is understand the customer's language as well. And that's something, having worked in several different domains. I've worked in train industry for a bit. I've certainly worked in defense aerospace for a long time. And even because we plug into different aspects of the military, the Air Force have different terminology from the Army, have different terminology for the Navy. So it's great to be able to dig in and have that niche, as you say, with a particular subset, because the whole product cycle goes a lot quicker because you're able to communicate. You already understand what they're looking for. You understand what language and terminology they use. So that allows you to kind of get in there a lot quicker and really dig into the heart of the problem.
Good point. You can move a lot more quickly, right? They recognize you being familiar with the terminology that they use, and I'm sure your customer feels like you just get them, right? And they don't need to walk you through the most basic concepts, which to them are just commonplace, which they likely would if they're working with someone who did what you did, but not specifically for their industry, right? So it helps them tremendously as well, too. Well put. So another question I was going to have for you, which I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about, is since the focus on the work that we do, helping people build product businesses, is usually begins with, all right, what problem are you solving, right? And if you haven't identified that yet, let's go about trying to solve it. You've mentioned several times, right, identifying those critical needs and the problems that need solving. How do you guys go about doing that with your customer, and who's typically involved?
Okay, so usually there's a combination of people involved. We certainly always like to have 2 or 3 what I call subject matter experts. So they tend to be engineers who are familiar with specific parts of the aircraft. They may be familiar with the operation of it, how it's being used in context, and what they're trying to get out of the data that they're trying to visualize, and what's the piece of insight that we can give them? What's the core root question that we can answer? So we'll engage with them. We quite often engage with in some cases, a further customer rep themselves. So somebody who represents our customer's customer, so to speak. So we can really get a good mix in. And once whiteboarding is clearly an easy way of doing it. I'm a huge proponent of getting into a room and rolling up your sleeves and getting around a whiteboard and kind of really starting to dig into the problem. I roll out a whole bunch of different techniques at that point. We certainly aim to develop user stories because we go through an agile methodology. Even if we're just trying to do a small data analysis where maybe the end output is only a report, we'll still go through a little agile methodology so we can be iterative with it, because we want to dig in and get to the best answer. And it may be much shorter sprint cycles, but we'll still use that as an approach. Quite often, my favorite whiteboarding technique is something called yes and to start with. So nobody's allowed to say no. You've just got to focus on kind of building on what they're looking for. So what's the art of the possible? That really helps kind of free people's minds a little bit to open up the dialogue and the problem solving. And then we can loop back around that and really start to hone in, okay, how are we going to do this specifically? What are the key aspects that you want to dig in on? And what are the things that you can do without, so we can at least arrive at a proof of concept, which is kind of pre-MVP, just to allow them to say, okay, yeah, this will work for me. In some cases, if that's a visual, we quite often use a wireframing tool to kind of mock some things up, get some feedback there. That's always a good cycle to, if you present something to them, whether that's some initial results from an analysis or and kind of the initial story behind it as well, because that's storytelling is key to the data analytics side of things, or a couple of wireframes, then people can really start to visualize it and come up with the appropriate questions to say, well, that's not quite how it works. I think it should be a bit more like this. And then that's where you get into what I believe is the richest dialogue, the back and forth, where you can really start to refine it.
Excellent. And what I would take away from that is a couple of things that you mentioned, right? Identifying the personas who are involved in better understanding the problem and understanding the context around it, then getting them in a room together so that they could all kind of discuss it, offer their perspective. The whiteboard I love. I almost can't sit still in a room that has a whiteboard in it if I'm speaking. I have to be up there. I have to be drawing something. I've almost figured out that I'm a better communicator using the visual element, right? It's just the visual component is so powerful when it comes to communicating something, right? I may try to describe something verbally to someone that could probably be a very simple diagram and really help them connect the dots a lot faster than I ever could trying to describe it to them verbally. So I love the whiteboard component. And also what I want people to focus on is something you said in testing, right? You don't immediately, even when you understand the problem much better, you don't immediately go into an advanced, significant investment in time and money into creating that around some form of technology, right? You talked about testing it with wireframes, some mock-ups, and then getting that back in front of the customer. That's huge too. I talk about a lot when we're talking about the idea stage, where we have a better understanding of the problem, but now we need to verify that the solution that we're intending to bring to market adequately solves that problem. I'm doing some like usability testing as well too. I'm studying usability testing now, so I'm really diving into that, both theory and practice, and I'm hooked. Like I'm immediately hooked. Started the book that I'm diving into now is called Don't Make Me Think, which relatively popular in the usability space, but it really does a good job of communicating how you want to go about testing something once you're thinking about building something around solving a problem. So well put. Yeah. So thank you so much for being here, sharing your insight. Very valuable for myself and the listeners. A couple other questions I have for you, Ben, are number one, are there any resources that you would recommend for myself or our audience from the perspective of books, blogs, other podcasts, any kind of resources that could help in and around this space of engineering, solving problems, product businesses that you'd be interested in sharing with our audience?
So there's nothing specific in that as in particular podcast names that I would that spring to mind. Certainly, I use a lot of YouTube and podcasts to gain some general knowledge in this. I know my team in particular are very big proponents of Datacamp. That's where they can dig into some specific skills around the data science and the data analytics side of things, which is key. So I would certainly recommend that. I mentioned wireframing earlier on as well, and we've had some great success with Adobe XD. I know the Adobe toolkit isn't to everyone's liking, but I found that that's a very powerful way of rapidly developing those wireframes with a bit of interaction that can really get you some good feedback from the customer. So I'd recommend those. And Pluralsight is what my software developers tend to default to if they want to learn something new and learn a new technique. So yeah, I'm not sure how helpful that is, but those are the ones I would go for.
And a number of those are unique too from the shows, and then me asking this question. That's why I always love to ask it, because you never know what you're going to hear. Pluralsight's a great resource. I've used that plenty. The Adobe suite of products have recently converted me to a paying customer for Creative Cloud. And as indifferent as I was at the time, I have grown to really love the fact that I have access to a number of their products. And I haven't played around with that one yet for the wireframing perspective. So I'm really looking forward to kind of diving in there. I'm glad you mentioned that one too. And another one that doesn't come up often enough, I don't know if anyone's mentioned it yet, is YouTube. It is the second most popular search engine on the web. And there is just so much in the way of resources out there and available when it comes to video. I think it's something people should probably even be taking advantage of more, even though it is the #2 search engine, but it is that for a reason. So I'm glad that you've shared those. Those are all helpful. And I'll include links for them in the show notes. And then last question for me is, who should reach out to you and how can they get in touch?
I think anyone who's interested in this space is welcome to reach out to me. We're certainly always looking to kind of connect with people who are excited about the defense space and the data analytics space. So anyone on that side of things, you can find us at our website. I'm sure you can put the details on the podcast, or direct message me on LinkedIn. That's my kind of favorite social media of choice. So feel free to connect with me there and continue the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. I will include that in the notes. And thank you for being here, Ben, and sharing your insight.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me, Sean. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.